At last, here we are, the last pit stop before the release of Metroid Dread. AM2R was a phenomenal little game that gave Metroid fans something to sink their teeth into in 2016. However, people still clamored for Nintendo themselves to get their act together and give us a new Metroid game of their own. People were asking for a lot of things at that time. This was at the height of all the NX rumors. The Wii U was running on fumes and there just weren't a lot of standout first-party games to look forward to. But eventually, to our surprise, Nintendo listened? The Switch was revealed in October of 2016. A lot more was revealed about the system in January and it finally launched on March 3rd, 2017, marking the beginning of what felt like a huge comeback for the company. Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey were outstanding returns to form, with both of those games taking heavy inspiration from some of the most important games in their respective franchises. And the hype train just kept rolling, leading us to E3 2017. To this day, one of my favorite E3s from Nintendo. Mainly because of this. This all but confirmed that the Nintendo from the Wii U era was long dead, and this new Nintendo had two brand new Metroid games for us. The fourth installment of the Prime series and an official remake of Metroid II. Sure, nowadays it's funny to look back at this since Prime 4 still isn't out and hasn't been shown in any way, shape or form, although Bayonetta 3 was recently shown, so there is hope. But I still fondly look back at this moment. I jumped out of pure joy when these games were unveiled. There was no other feeling like it. It was weird that Nintendo decided to make the Metroid 2 remake for the 3DS and not the Switch. I mean, the Switch was their hot new console, and nearly everyone was sort of hoping that Nintendo would make it their sole focus, but fuck yeah! I didn't even care that it was a remake or that it felt a little redundant since AM2R wasn't even a year old yet. I was just happy that this was a thing that existed. Metroid Samus Returns was being developed by Mercury Steam, who had previously worked on the Castlevania Lords of Shadow games. They didn't receive the best reviews, but the footage I saw didn't worry me. It was still very much Metroid. Samus Returns came out on September 15th, 2017, and the consensus was that it was a very good game, and a great return to the traditional Metroid experience that hadn't been seen from Nintendo for 10 years. Unfortunately, and this was something that I feared as we were leading up to launch, the game didn't exactly fly off store shelves. Being on the 3DS really hurt it. People just weren't interested in picking up a 6-year-old handheld to play a remake of an old game in a series that hadn't had a good entry in a long time. As huge of a Metroid fan as I am, even I fell victim to this mindset. I wanted to play new games on my Switch and only on my Switch. So I didn't get Samus Returns right away. And if you haven't gotten the game yet but want to, I've got some bad news. Since the announcement of Dread, prices for Metroid games have skyrocketed and Samus Returns is, it's certainly not cheap for a game on a discontinued system. At least with the other Metroid games you have a couple of options, but Samus Returns as of this recording is still only on the 3DS. And if you don't even have a 3DS, that can have some pretty steep asking prices as well. Now I'll just spoil it right now and say, yes, this game is very good, and I like it a lot, and you should play it. But please, for the love of God, don't pay an unreasonable amount just to try it out yourself. These prices will eventually drop. Heads up though, in my experience the game suffered from some pretty bad stuttering on my 2DS, but ran perfectly okay on my new 3DS. So just to be safe, if you can, play the game on a new model. And I know I'm delaying the review portion quite a bit, but the last thing I'd like to say is, I'm sorry. To capture direct footage of the game, I had to play on an emulator because I don't have a 3DS capture device. And as I revealed in the last video, I don't exactly have optimal computer hardware for gaming. As such, some of the gameplay may have a few glitches and slowdown. My only other resort would have been recording my entire playthrough on my 3DS using my phone camera and, well, I didn't want to do that for obvious reasons. Again, I apologize, I hope you understand and that it isn't too distracting. And don't worry, I'm still going to be judging the game as if I were playing it on the original hardware. Now then, this is the 7th 2D Metroid game in this retrospective now, and the 3rd that is fundamentally an alternate version of the same core game. As I've done with the previous remakes in the retrospective, I will only tell a summarized version of the plot, and then mainly focus on what Samus Returns has changed from the original to make it a better Metroid 2 experience in my opinion. Mother Brain and the Space Pirate's evil intentions with the Metroid species were put to a stop by Samus Aran in the events of Metroid 1/0 mission. Concerned about these parasites, the Galactic Federation sends an elite squadron of soldiers to planet SR-388, where they first encountered the Metroids to learn more about them. The squadron is never heard from again though, and after analyzing some samples they managed to send back to HQ before communication was lost, the Galactic Federation Council unanimously agrees that the Metroids must all be exterminated. As Samus Aran, it is your job to go to SR-388 and explore it in its entirety, down to its very core to ensure that you kill every last one of them. And that's all there is to it really. At least on the surface. More than any other official 2D Metroid game, Samus Returns goes into detail about the Chozo, specifically a faction of Chozo during their time on SR-388 as they begin excavating to conduct research, leading to the discovery of none other than the X-Parasites. The Chozo, realizing how dangerous they are, decide to create a new parasite to counteract the X, a predator if you will. And I'll just leave it at that. I'm not going to spoil the rest of this story in case you haven't played the game yourself. The decision to include lore in this game through these images was great. While not as in-depth as something like the scan and data logs in Prime and AM2 are, these evoke a sense of mystery. They get the gears in your brain turning to try to decipher the tale being told through nothing but art. This Chozo plotline is restricted to the gallery though, you don't actually see these in the campaign, which is a shame, but I'm glad that they're here regardless. Samus Returns is the first 2D game to have in-game cinematics. Just like the comic book style panels in Zero Mission, they're short and sweet, and only the intro has dialogue. Since Samus doesn't talk, these cutscenes are an effective way of showing the player how Samus reacts to her surroundings as her mission grows more treacherous. That may sound odd since Samus isn't exactly a character known for emoting with that big ass helmet she has on, but animating even the subtlest and not so subtlest movements in a story heavily reliant on show don't tell is all you need to know what a character is thinking. I'm a fan of how the narrative is presented. I'm a fan of the presentation as a whole really. Do I prefer this over the pixel art of the previous entries? No, but that's just my own preference. Samus Returns looks good for a 3DS game. Sure, the polygon count isn't the highest and environments could look a tad muddy and generic at points, but it's a nice looking game overall. The background detail especially is really cool and hides a few things that I only noticed on my most recent playthrough. And like I said, the cinematics are an awesome bonus, and I love how they are incorporated in certain parts of the gameplay like boss fights and, one of the more controversial additions, the melee counter. In terms of what Samus can do mobility wise, there's not a whole lot that's new. I'd say the control is most comparable to Fusion. It's not as fast paced as Zero Mission or AM2 are, and you can't do single wall jumps. The melee counter and the 360-degree aiming is what sets Samus Returns apart from every other 2D Metroid game. And they both play a critical role in how the game seems like it's meant to be approached. Enemies are bloodthirsty in this game. They will actively hunt you down if they're on screen and lunge at you as soon as they get the chance. By pressing the X button at just the right time, you can counter these lunges. As long as you immediately start firing and press nothing else after countering, almost every enemy will die in one hit. If you jump, accidentally melee again, or even move a pixel after you counter the enemy, the one-hit kill opportunity will be lost and they will now take much more punishment until they die. Why does this happen? I have no idea, but all of this is to say that this is the mechanic that makes up the main gameplay loop of Samus Returns: stop and go. You see an enemy, stop, counter, shoot, and go. Rinse and repeat until you get the plasma beam, after which this strategy isn't as necessary. In the first few areas though, if you don't do this, haha, you're fucked. Because Samus Returns is Samus at her most frail and vulnerable, aside from this I guess. It is not out of the ordinary for just a couple of hits to deplete multiple tanks of energy. Not counting the original Metroid, I would say that Samus Returns is the most difficult Metroid game ever made. It does not mess around. If you go into this expecting to play the game like you would almost every other 2D Metroid, you're gonna see this screen a frustrating amount of times. The key takeaway there though is if you play it like almost every other Metroid. The way the mechanics of the melee counter work, combined with a new free aim mode that halts your movement and forces you to point wherever you want to shoot with your feet planted on the ground, it is very clear that Mercury Steam made the game with the hope that players would take a slower, more methodical approach as they explore SR-388. Again, at least until you acquire more power-ups that allow you to play a little more carelessly. I honestly think your enjoyment of this game will depend on if you can get used to this style of play. If you're a purist who expects 2D Metroid to be a certain way, Samus Returns probably is not for you. And for others, the high challenge can be a turnoff. But if a slower Metroidvania isn't something that bothers you, then the difficulty isn't an impossible hurdle to overcome. You can still have a good time with the game. There are now checkpoints that make death not as big of an issue with how generously placed they are, and save points and recharge stations have never been this abundant. As for what I think of the counter and 360 aiming, it did take me some time to get accustomed to it, but after a while, especially after multiple playthroughs, I accepted this approach to Metroid gameplay for what it is. It's different, but it's not bad. It's like playing a Prime game, but in 2D. If I had the option, I would opt for something more traditional though. I'm also probably not so negative toward it, seeing how Dread is seemingly an expansion on the foundation of Samus Returns' gameplay. It's clearly here to stay. The least I could do is try to enjoy what's being given to me, especially when it is by no means bad. Samus Returns, like Metroid II and AM2R, is a Metroid game where progression is linear. It's the same shtick as before. There's Metroids to kill all the Metroids in an area for the poison to clear way to the next area, repeat a bunch of times until you reach the end. There are a few opportunities for you to be a little explorer and complete certain events in a different sequence, but for all intents and purposes, progression is very streamlined. And for the people like me who adored the freedom Nintendo made sure to include in their other Metroid remake, I've got some bad news. They did the complete opposite with Samus Returns, deliberately going out of their way, sometimes in an obnoxious manner, to prevent players from having even the slightest chance of doing things or collecting things a little out of order. When I see all this shit on the walls and these randomly placed events all around the planet, I'm disappointed. It's almost insulting, like a level designer somewhere is actively taunting me. I don't know if this was Mercury Steam's decision or Nintendo's decision, but whoever's it was, it's as if these were last minute additions after somebody inspected the map and made observations like, hey look, players might be able to get that item too early, put some gunk in the way, that'll teach those fucking speedrunners. Okay, I know that no one actually said that, but it's the scenario I've made up in my mind thus it's the only explanation, so shut up. So yes, Samus Returns is... linear. However, Fusion is also kinda like this, and I and a bunch of others think that game is great. It's all a matter of what you like more at the end of the day. Of course, this means that again the postgame is a stupid piece of shit and I hate its guts, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. SR388, like Zebes from Zero Mission, is dramatically remixed while still feeling very familiar. Of the two remakes, AM2R is certainly the more faithful of the two in terms of level and map design. Samus Returns' environments are massive. A lot of areas have an entirely new aesthetic so that not everything is a bunch of boring blue caves. Many areas are now divided into multiple sub-areas, meaning you're going to be seeing this elevator scene a lot. The map layout isn't my favorite because you will frequently run into dead ends, really driving in the whole linearity thing home. Thankfully, new to the 2D games, there is a method of skip travel. Activating these teleport stations allows you to transport between them, and if smartly used can drastically cut down on the backtracking. I still would have liked some more thoughtful level design that loops around though that wouldn't make me feel so dependent on these. But really, I cannot stress how huge this game is. There were points in my first playthrough where there were 20 minutes between Metroid fights, and that is not uncommon. Samus Returns is a thick lad, undoubtedly the longest 2D Metroid game. My first playthrough, going for 100% mind you, took me a little over 10 hours. For Metroid, that's a long runtime, but at least I can say that I was having fun for most of it, which is what matters. The game's world is a treat to run through, from the serene underwater depths of Area 5 to the Chozo Laboratory and Tower in Area 7. And as always, finding power-ups to make yourself stronger is what makes Metroid so addicting. Being a Metroid remake, there are no brand new items here. Hell, even an existing item that was added to Zero Mission and AM2R is missing in Samus Returns, the Speed Booster. A damn shame, since it has always been my favorite power-up and I think Mercury Steam could have come up with some neat puzzles with it. Pretty much everything else is here though, including the return of the grappling beam that hasn't been seen since Super Metroid. However, equipping it as your dedicated beam requires you to tap its icon on the bottom screen, which to me is unintuitive. Thankfully there is a workaround. With free aim, if you point at a grappling spot, the grappling beam will automatically be selected. Which I didn't know on my first playthrough, that sucked. No such workaround for the ice beam and super missiles though. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, I hate this. I hate having to use the touchscreen to switch missile types, and I despise that the ice beam has been separated from the others instead of stacking it like it's been done since 1994. I don't know why they did this. Is it because freezing an enemy and shooting it with a missile is overpowered, which would make the melee counter a lot less integral in the early hours? It can't be that, because if they kept it how it was in the other games, where only the shot before an enemy dies freezes it, the melee attack would still be the most viable option in combat since enemies have so much health. I only ever use the ice beam if it's required to make a jump and when fighting Metroids. Every other item is cool though. And like I said, once you acquire the plasma beam, enemies start dropping like flies so you can just run everywhere pew-pewing everything with less fear of getting bitch slapped all over the place. The screw attack has been strangely nerfed though. Now some enemies will take more than one hit to be killed. They really want you to use that melee counter. Samus Returns may not have any new items, but it did bring these new Aeon abilities for Samus to use, and these are pretty cool. The Scan Pulse is a godsend for beginners, or for anyone really that ever gets stuck. And it's not like you have to use it. If you prefer the classic Metroid vibe of only using your available map to get by, then you can keep doing that. Lightning armor is crucial for surviving longer on this hellish planet and is used to bypass venomous weeds and other harmful terrain. The Beam Burst is a super powerful offensive ability that shreds through these foes like you wouldn't believe. And the Phase Drift slows down time, required for certain puzzles and can be advantageous in combat. All of these consume your Aeon gauge, which can be expanded with these new Aeon expansions, preventing them from being too overpowered. And here's another incentive to use the melee counter. Landing a successful hit gives you a bunch of Aeon orbs to fill up your gauge. These are all wonderful, and I hope that Aeon abilities make some sort of a return in Metroid Dread. Unless they already confirmed it in the trailer or something, I wouldn't know because I'm avoiding all trailers until it launches. This wouldn't be Metroid 2 without, of course, the Metroids. Before we get to them, however, I'll do what I did in my AM2R review and mention the other bosses first. Arachnus returns and is basically a beefed up version of his Game Boy counterpart. Not a lot to say about him really, there isn't any added twist like in AM2R, it's all about blowing his ass up with missiles. But things start to get more interesting with the Diggernaut. Not counting the final one, the Diggernaut is the only new non-Metroid boss here, and I love it. The main reason being its persistence. The Diggernaut is not solely shackled to a standard encounter. It appears throughout your playthrough to give you shit, making it a great secondary villain of sorts. It steals certain power-ups before you can get to them. There's a really challenging escape sequence involving it that requires quick thinking and application of your moves to beat it. And once you actually face the fucker, the fight is intense and its attack patterns are satisfying to learn and dodge. And to close it all off, now I couldn't show that with direct footage because I ran into a nasty glitch during the fight on the emulator I'm playing the game on that prevented me from beating it. The bombs you need to use to take it out in the final phase weren't working properly, and for a moment I thought that I was going to have to record the rest of the game straight off of my 3DS. Lucky me though, speedrunners found a way to skip the Diggernaut fight entirely and still collect the power bombs that it drops. And after an hour of trial and error, I finally managed to pull off the glitch, which was incredibly relieving and rewarding. I'm very proud of myself for that. But enough about sequence breaking, onto the Metroids. I don't think it's surprising that for the third time I'm saying that the Metroid fights are the worst part about a Metroid 2 game. Well, second worst in this case. They aren't bad, but again, they just aren't that interesting. They're certainly the most aggressive they've ever been, and it can be pretty fun studying their movements and finding out the best strategies to take them down, but there's just too many. And to make things worse than the original in AM2R, the fights are padded out. I'm referring of course mainly to the Gamma Metroids. These pricks will sometimes decide that they're bored of you and move to a different room, and sometimes they'll do this more than once before they die. And it's made even worse if you die because then you have to start the entire fight over. The other Metroid forms at least are much more tolerable because they don't pull this shit. Alphas are as basic as you would expect, and Zetas and Omegas are the most fun to face since they're more involved than Gammas and don't switch rooms every 10 seconds for the sake of stalling. And countering their attacks is a joy to witness with how the camera follows Samus as she flips around and does her usual Samus thing, being a badass. These are also probably the most difficult larval Metroids in the whole series, mainly because if you don't hit them with a fully charged ice beam, they'll break free faster than you can say. The Queen Metroid is a really good boss. You have to make use of a lot of your abilities and act fast if you want to make it out alive. And you can even still roll into her stomach and plant a power— oh, never mind. Another emulator glitch. Trust me, it's sick. As is expected, Samus runs into the last Metroid after taking down the Queen, the infant Metroid, and it's absolutely adorable.
I shall call him Squishy, and he shall be mine, and he shall be my Squishy. Come here, Squishy.
But in a sudden turn of events on your way back to your ship, there are still enemies for you to fight. And there are still items for you to collect along the way, some of them requiring the help from the baby to break away at these jewel-shaped rocks. Which, now that I think about it, I've been seeing all throughout my journey and— oh no! ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the post-game of Samus Returns. Now to be fair, this isn't all on the baby Metroid. There aren't actually that many items that absolutely require its help. A lot of times when you see these rocks blocking an item, there is an alternate way of getting it in case you would want to do a bit of cleanup before the endgame. But here's the thing, cleanup at any point before you have the baby is not worth it. Because Samus Returns is a linear game, meaning that backtracking, even with all of these teleporters, is more of a chore than in any other 2D Metroid game. The best choice is to wait until the very end of the game to go after all the items you missed if you want to get 100%. And if you've seen my Fusion and Zero Mission reviews, you know that I think that this is not fun. I like that each area has its own percentage total so you know when you can move on to the next. And yeah, the scan pulse makes this not as arduous as it could have been, but come on, man. This was the worst part of Fusion, it was the worst part of Zero Mission, and it is the worst part of Samus Returns. I'm tired of these games being purposefully designed to have a bunch of post-game backtracking. I really don't want to have to complain about this again when Metroid Dread arrives, but at this point, it wouldn't shock me. To make matters worse, Samus Returns has so many items. And some of them gave me a lot of shit on my first playthrough, like the ones where you have to do a Powerbomb Morph Ball launch to obtain, which the game doesn't explain to you at all. Though, that's really just me venting since I'm sure some would argue that this sort of thing is in every other Metroid game, so I'll let it slide. And I'll give Samus Returns this, it adds incentive to go for 100% other than getting a slightly different ending and a sense of accomplishment. Those images revealing stuff about the Chozo, they're unlocked as you raise that completion total. This is a case where I find the destination to be more fulfilling than the journey, which is totally backwards compared to what I like about completing Metroid games. Also, you couldn't at least make Fusion Mode another reward for getting 100%? Fusion Mode is the hardest difficulty, enemies do a fuck ton more damage and Samus is wearing the fusion suit. Fun fact, this was something that was also eventually added into AM2R. The difference is that if you wanted to unlock Fusion Mode in Samus Returns, you had to pay. This and a sound test are forever locked behind a set of Samus Returns amiibo. They were hard to find when the game was new, and they are even harder to find now. This shit was an omen, I swear. And this ending, I don't know how to feel about it. Metroid II always had the most unique ending of any Metroid game. Just a calm, reflective walk back to Samus' ship with the last Metroid by her side and the peaceful escape music playing in the background. It gives you time to think back on the journey you just had. Even if you didn't have that good of a time with it like me when I beat the original Metroid II, there was something to be said about how even that game managed to elicit a feeling of relaxation and ease. Samus Returns, I think, tackles the ending in a much less interesting way. Meta Ridley from the Prime games shows up, already wanting to take the baby for himself. It is a thrilling fight, and of course I gushed when I saw Mr. Too Big for Smash for the first time since the incident. I love the remix of his theme, I love how fucking ruthless Samus is. I love how the baby Metroid even helps her out, alluding to how it'll save the bounty hunter's life from a much more dangerous foe in the future. But again, those endings in the original and AM2R were something else, something refreshing and memorable. This Ridley fight is certainly memorable in a different way, and I like how it basically makes the Prime games canon after Sakamoto tried so hard to phase out their canonicity, but it's definitely here more for fan service than anything else. And now it also makes me question why Samus and the Federation weren't more on edge during the Super Metroid prologue. After this happened, they had to anticipate another space pirate attack, right? Ah well, it's a different take, which you can say lines up with the rest of this remake. Samus Returns is almost a completely new game. It's the most overhauled of the remakes by far, from the world design to the difficulty and gameplay. The soundtrack is pretty great too. There are some pretty great remixes of classic Metroid music here. Samus Returns even borrows from the Prime trilogy. The item pickup fanfare is ripped straight from those games. And I've gotta say, it fits right in. It's the least similar to the Metroid games that most people are familiar with, but as I stated in the beginning of the video, it's still very much Metroid. And I believe it succeeds at being a good game in its own right. And you know, that's what Metroid desperately needed. A new, good game. It certainly could have benefited from more sales. Maybe these poor numbers are the reason why it took us 4 years to get another Metroid related thing from Nintendo. But at least we can say we're getting more Metroid. So in conclusion, yeah, I really like Samus Returns. I like all of these games in different ways, even the ones that I will almost never revisit again. They're still important to me on a whole nother level. There is no other franchise quite like Metroid. Well, there is a whole subgenre dedicated to these kinds of games, but you know what I mean. There's nothing quite like a new Metroid game. I can always count on these games to be here when I want to put myself in the shoes of a lone bounty hunter, single-handedly facing off a horde of creatures and getting stronger and stronger as I make my way through the depths of an alien world. There's no other Metroidvania I'd rather play than one starring Samus Aran, the star of some of the best games ever created. Here is my final tier list of the 2D Metroid games now that we're at the end of the road to Metroid Dread. I hope that I've been consistent enough in what I've been saying in these videos that these rankings will make sense. And as you may be able to tell by how each of these tiers are titled, there aren't very many Metroid games that I would say aren't worth playing. Hell, even the ones I tell you to skip, go for them if you want to. Maybe you'll find something that I didn't. The comments you guys have been leaving in these videos have certainly opened my eyes to how many people like Metroid II, for example. To those of you who have stuck around throughout this whole marathon or jumped in somewhere in the middle, thank you. I'm glad I was able to share my thoughts on these games and see that even just a couple of people cared enough about some random guy's ramblings to subscribe and stay till the end of this retrospective. And I hope you all stick around for the future, of course. But now, enough with replaying games that I've been playing for years. I'm ready, my body is ready, for Metroid Dread. And if you want to find out what I think about it, well, you know where to find me. Until then, stay safe, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching. Oh yeah, what is this item total, Nintendo? Why the fuck?